and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Amazingly, it was just over a week ago that Joe Biden single-handedly ended gun violence in the United States. How'd you miss that? Well, you probably were distracted by all the other amazing things Joe Biden is doing, like making air travel more efficient and winning the war in Ukraine. So you probably weren't paying attention on June 25th when a law called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was signed. And it, true to its name, was in fact bipartisan. Fashionably liberal Republicans like John Cornyn helped write it. So the question is, will it live up to the second half? Will it make communities safer? Emphatically, yes, said Joe Biden, quote, it's going to save a lot of lives. How many lives exactly? Well, in the characteristically modest words of Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, quote, what we are doing will save thousands of lives. Thousands. And that makes a kind of sense, because now that we're going to have red flag laws in all 50 states, laws that allow the government to disarm you by force without charging you with a crime, without bothering with due process, once we do that, and we are doing it, mass shootings like the one we saw in Buffalo this spring will never happen again. That's what they promised us, and the media assured us it was true, every word of it. What they never mentioned was it was not only ridiculous and false, it was provably false, because actually gun control does not stop bad people from using guns. It's not a talking point, it's a fact. Here's how you know. On the day that 18-year-old Peyton Gendron murdered 10 people in Buffalo, the state of New York already had a red flag law. And Gendron was exactly the sort of person they told us that red flag laws would stop from committing mass murder. Gendron had bragged in school, remember, that he wanted to murder large groups of people. That was a red flag, speaking of. He'd already been caught by his mother killing a cat with his hands. Gendron was so obviously crazy and threatening that at one point, New York State Police came over and investigated him. But in the end, nothing happened. It had no effect, these laws. And that's not surprising. Ask anyone who knows anything about violence and who isn't getting paid to lie to you about it, and you will learn the truth, which is it's almost impossible to stop someone who's dead set on harming other people. Prison guards get killed regularly. There are no guns in prison. There are plenty of psychopaths. Psychopaths are the problem. In case you need still more evidence, just yesterday on the 4th of July, there was yet another mass shooting in the state of Illinois. Illinois is a state with red flag laws, assault weapons bans, every other form of gun control that authoritarians can dream up in a country that still has the Second Amendment. But the shooting happened anyway. It happened in Highland Park, which is a pretty suburb north of Chicago. And once again, the shooter was exactly the person they claimed red flag laws would stop before he hurt others. His name is Robert Crimo. He's a 21-year-old amateur rapper with a long and documented history of bizarre and very threatening behavior. And on Monday, he lived up to what everyone who knew him thought he might someday do. He dressed in women's clothes, he scaled a fire escape ladder to the roof of a local business, and then he opened fire on a parade. Here's what it looked like. So awful. As cited, authorities say 7 people have died from that shooting. At least 36 others are wounded. Here's what it looked like from the ground. Good people, terrified, bleeding, in some cases dead on the 4th of July. It's awful. Now, a normal person sees a tape like that and takes a breath as the tragedy of it sinks in, as it should. Americans were just murdered for no reason. So pause a beat before politicizing their deaths. Show some respect. You owe them that. But social media do not encourage respect. Social media are the domain of partisans. And the first question a partisan asks never changes. It's this: how can I use other people's misery to become more powerful myself? So on the basis of that, the usual morons leap in to blame the other team. They did it! It's their fault! Elect me! Eric Swalwell did this immediately, of course, speaking of morons, but so did many others. These are the sort of people whose first instinct is to ascribe political or racial motives to every crime to prove their point about how they were right all along. And sometimes they are right. Sometimes racists and ideologues do commit crimes, but that's not the majority. Some mass killers are white, some mass killers are black, some are right-wing, quite a few are left-wing, actually, that the New York Times never mentions it. But one thing nearly all mass killers have in common, almost every single one of them, with some but few exceptions, all of them are alienated young men. That's the common thread. They're young, they're male, they're crazy. Robert Crimo certainly fit that stereotype. Have you seen the guy's picture? If he sat next to you on the bus, you would move immediately. He literally had face tattoos and dressed in costume in public. On his YouTube channel, which for some reason was very quickly scrubbed from the internet by authorities, why is that? We found it. Crimo posted videos of the presidential motorcade along with newspaper clippings about the Kennedy assassination, speaking of red flags. Months ago, he was filming the Highland Park parade group, the one he shot up. Not surprisingly, at a press conference today, police acknowledged they had encountered Crimo several times before. 3 years ago, for example, police arrived after he had attempted to kill himself.
I'm going to relay some information from 2 prior instances that occurred here in Highland Park. The first was in April of 2019. An individual contacted Highland Park Police Department a week after learning of Mr. Crimo attempting suicide. This was a delayed report, so Highland Park still responded to the residents a week later, spoke with Crimo, spoke with Crimo's parents, and the matter was being handled by mental health professionals at that time. The second occurred in September of 2019. A family member reported that Crimo said he was going to kill everyone, and Crimo had a collection of knives. The police responded to his residence. The police removed 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword from Crimo's home.
So there you have it. Back in April of 2019, police found out that Crimo had tried to kill himself. And then a few months later, in September, he threatened to, quote, kill everyone. So police took away his knives, and that was it. They didn't follow up. But even if they had, what would they have done? Taken away his guns? You get more knives. In any case, police didn't think the situation warranted further steps, as we saw Crimo was still able to buy firearms legally despite being obviously mentally ill. Now, pause for a second. Why is that? Look at Robert Bobby Crimo. Would you sell a gun to that guy? Does he seem like a nutcase? Of course he does. So why didn't anyone raise an alarm? Well, maybe because he didn't stand out. Maybe because there are a lot of young men in America who suddenly look and act a lot like this guy. It's not an attack, it's just true. Like Crimo, they inhabit a solitary fantasy world of social media, porn, and video games. They're high on government-endorsed weed. Smoke some more, it's good for you. They're numbed by the endless psychotropic drugs that are handed out at every school in the country by crackpots posing as counselors. And of course, they're angry. They know that their lives will not be better than their parents. They'll be worse. That's all but guaranteed. They know that. They're not that stupid. And yet the authorities in their lives, mostly women, never stops lecturing them about their so-called privilege. You're male, you're privileged. Imagine that. Try to imagine an unhealthier, unhappier life than that. So a lot of young men in America are going nuts. Are you surprised? And by the way, a shockingly large number of them have been prescribed psychotropic drugs by their doctors, SSRIs or antidepressants. And that would include quite a few mass shooters. And keep in mind, again, these drugs are meant to prevent crazy behavior. And yet there seems to be a connection. Eric Harris, the Columbine killer, was on both Zoloft and Luvox. A year earlier, a 15-year-old called Kip Kinkle shot his parents and dozens of classmates. He was on Prozac. In 2005, a 16-year-old called Jeff Wiesa killed his grandfather and 10 kids in Minnesota. He was on Prozac too. So was 27-year-old Stephen Kamerzak, who murdered 6 people at Northern Illinois University. In 2012, you may recall, when 25-year-old James Holmes walked into a movie theater and shot 82 people. He was on Zoloft. The list goes on and on and on and on. It includes the shooter at the Washington Navy Yard in 2013. That would be 34-year-old Aaron Alexis. It also includes Dylan Roof. He's the 21-year-old who shot up the church in Charleston. Now, he was apparently a racist, and we've heard a lot about that. Fine. But we've heard next to nothing about the fact that he was taking SSRIs. He and many, many others. You're not supposed to notice, but some have. The Journal of Political Psychology once assembled a list of dozens more mass killings, all committed by young people, young men, on prescription drugs. So is there a connection? Well, we don't know definitively. We do know there are a whole lot more of these drugs being taken by kids than ever before, and by the entire population who's not taking some prescription medication at this point. Between 1991 and 2018, total SSRI prescriptions in the United States rose by more than 3,000%. 3,000%! 3,000%. 3,000% of anything is a massive change. You don't see changes like that. But the point of this change was to make Americans calmer, saner, happier. Take these drugs and your problems will go away. Yes, you will become numb. You will lose part of yourself. You no longer experience deep joy. You'll become part robot, but at least you won't want to kill yourself or harm other people. That was the promise. 3,000%. Did it work? Let's see. Over the very same period, the suicide rate in the United States jumped by 35%. Did it work? Well, millions of people got on anti-suicide drugs and we wound up with many more suicides. So maybe it's not working. Is it possible it's making the problem worse? You think? Let's see. Mass shootings also increased dramatically over the very same period. Here's a chart that shows it. Now, the halfwits on Twitter always scream the same thing. Correlation is not causation. All right, whatever that means. But tell us, halfwits, what is going on exactly? What does that chart mean? We know that SSRIs are dangerous. It says so right on the label. They increase, quote, the risk of anxiety, agitation, irritability, hostility, aggressiveness, impulsivity, and mania. Oh, not a big deal. That's not causation. Then what is it? According to one meta-study by the FDA, young people who've been prescribed SSRIs have an increased rate of suicide. Oh, wait, more suicide? Weren't they supposed to reduce suicide, but we're getting more suicide? Let's stop right there. But we're not stopping. We're accelerating. Between 2015 and 2019, the use of SSRI drugs by teens in the United States rose by nearly 40%. So it's not working. Let's do a whole lot more of it. This seems like a massive and extremely obvious problem. Extremely obvious. People aren't themselves. They're taking drugs that appear to be causing the behavior that drugs are designed to prevent. Why don't they talk about this on TV? Oh, let's see. In 2020, the pharmaceutical industry spent more than $4.5 billion advertising on national television in this country. Now, how much is that? Well, to put it in some context, Pfizer spent more on advertising in 2020 than it did on research and development. But it wasn't a bad decision, it was a great decision. Pfizer's revenue doubled last year to more than $81 billion. Now, how'd they do that? Well, the ad campaign paid off. It helped convince politicians to require the entire population take Pfizer products. Products that don't work as advertised, that have killed large numbers of people, and whose side effects are indemnified against lawsuits by the United States Congress. That's quite a business model. You might think it could be a subject of a media story. But no stories on Pfizer. They're paid to be fanboys of Pfizer, therefore they are. Here's a tweet, for example, from CNBC, which is ostensibly a news organization, and we're quoting. Pfizer is uniquely positioned to advance mRNA, which could be a breakthrough for other infectious diseases, genetic diseases, and cancer. Parenthesis, paid post for Pfizer, hashtag ad. It's on their Twitter account, a news organization. They're admitting it's a paid post for Pfizer. But in CNBC's defense, they're not alone. Pretty much all the news coverage you see in the United States is a paid post for Pfizer. Watch this.
Anderson Cooper 360, brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Pfizer.
The Human Factor, brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch, sponsored by Pfizer.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight, brought to you by Pfizer.
Oh, it's all brought to you by Pfizer. Now, why is that? Because TV channels don't prescribe drugs. Doctors do. So why would Pfizer, a drug company, be advertising on television? Well, we're not sure of the answer. Well, let's put it this way. Don't hold your breath waiting for CNN or Good Morning America to do a hard-hitting investigative piece on the potential connection between prescription drugs and violence. Probably not going to happen since they sponsor those channels. They're going to keep telling you it's all about guns. It's all about guns. Does anyone really believe it's all about guns? No one thinks that. If you really thought that guns caused violence, you would, for example, demand far harsher prosecution of gun possession in the cities. That's where most of the shootings are taking place. But no one's doing that. Why? Because that's where Democratic voters live. So there's no chance anyone's going to crack down on them. Instead, politicians are using these tragedies to do what they've always wanted to do, which is disarm their political opponents. Here's someone who's kind of dumb enough to say it out loud. This is the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker.
It is devastating that a celebration of America was ripped apart by our uniquely American plague. A day dedicated to freedom has put into stark relief the one freedom we as a nation refuse to uphold, the freedom of our fellow citizens to live without the daily fear of gun violence. It's the 4th of July, a day for reflection on our freedoms. Our founders carried muskets, not assault weapons. And I don't think a single one of them would have said that you have a constitutional right to an assault weapon with a high-capacity magazine.
Does a single person watching that, does even one person watching that believe for a second that J.B. Pritzker has had an authentic human emotion in the last 20 years other than gluttony, greed, and the lust for power? No, no one believes that. This is politics. Disarm the law-abiding. That's the first thing every authoritarian regime does, of course. Make sure the other side can't fight back, of course. That's what they all do. So, of course, in New York, the state's unelected governor, speaking of democracy, her name was Kathy Hochul, used to have a little vaccinated necklace, probably doesn't wear that anymore. But Hochul has approved a law requiring gun buyers to provide their social media accounts to the government. Paging First Amendment lawyers here. Applicants must prove to Kathy Hochul's satisfaction that they have, and we're quoting, the essential character, temperament, and judgment necessary to be entrusted with a weapon. So the idea is Kathy Hochul, who's not been elected governor, is the holder of your rights, and she kind of doles them out based on your obedience. Now, this is an inversion of the basic promise of America, which is your rights came before the government. They were given to you by God. Can we use that word now? And the government merely safeguards them. But once you get rid of that, like Joe Biden does, once you start telling us that I've got your rights, and if you do what I tell you to do, I'll give them to you, there's nothing you can't do. So New York's not stopping there. New York has also just made it a felony to carry a firearm in any public place, unless you're Kathy Hochul's bodyguards. That would include public transit, Times Square. You can't carry a firearm in churches or schools where mass shootings have been known to occur. So that means the law-abiding in New York can't defend themselves. So are there data on this? Did Kathy Hochul consult some kind of study telling this would save lives? No, not even pretending. She's doing it just because she feels like it. Just admitted that on camera. Watch.
Governor, do you have the numbers to show that it's the concealed carry permit holders that are committing crimes?
I don't need to have numbers. I don't have to have a data point to say that this is going to make. All I know is I have a responsibility to the people of this state.
Oh, I don't need numbers. I don't need to have the numbers.
Don't let
I'm
that
acting
get in the
purely
way.
on emotion. Because this is how I feel. Because I care. Wow. Living down to the stereotype, anybody? There's no actual evidence it will work. She doesn't need that. She wants more power. Watch Kathy Hochul explain.
Imagine you're on a crowded subway and you bang into somebody inadvertently. Tempers flare, and the person that you banged into happens to be carrying a concealed weapon. Imagine you're in a bar. Someone starts a fight. They have a concealed weapon on them. Imagine you're in Times Square visiting with your family. You're on the way to a show with your family, and you're surrounded by people with concealed weapons. Does that make you feel more or less safe?
Where's your vaccinated necklace, Kathy Hochul? Weren't you just bragging about that? You're not bragging about being vaccinated anymore? Why is that exactly? Maybe she'll come out and explain. But her reasoning is, as soon as we tell people on the subway, bad people, they can't have guns, they'll immediately obey Kathy Hochul because they voted for her. Oh, wait, nobody did? Because bad people follow the rules? Is that what she's saying? What is she saying exactly? We're not sure. Maybe Jason Whitlock knows. He's the host of Fearless. He joins us now. Jason, great to see you tonight. So it seems like, once again, we're talking about everything except what is really obvious. There's a problem with young men of all political views and colors. Young men are in trouble, no?
There's a problem with American culture. We are looking at the ramifications of a cultural rot. And you spelled it out beautifully. I think that there are a number of Americans and the science crowd and the cultural elites who believe we're the smartest people in the history of the planet, and we're really the dumbest. And we really think we've outsmarted God's natural order, that the development of children we can put on the back burner. If there's a problem with your kid, Pfizer has a pill that will correct it.
Exactly.
If you're a woman, the most important right you have is the right to kill the baby growing in your womb. And so that's a message and an indication of a mindset that the development and the cultivation and the nurturing of children isn't a priority in America. And that's why these Robert Cremos are being created, because as a society, as a culture, we put them on the back burner. We told them they don't matter. We're telling young boys, particularly if they're heterosexual and have Christian views, that they're the worst people on the planet. They're responsible for everything that has gone wrong on the planet. You're horrible. And then we've normalized the way they present themselves, and insanity, tattooing up their faces, rapping about killing and murdering people. We've normalized all of this insanity. And so we can't look at a Robert Cremo and go, hey, this looks abnormal because everybody's doing this. He's just mimicking what he's seen the people we're celebrating do. And so we can't even say, hey, this isn't a proper look for a young person. This isn't a proper way to present yourself. Why isn't it? Every rapper that I know that has been Super Bowl halftime or whatever, they have demonic, satanic, violent music, just like the stuff Robert Cremo was producing. Tucker, if we don't return to some biblical values, the greatest experiment in human history is going down in a massive ball of flames, and I'm talking about America.
Jason Whitlock, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we spent last week in Brazil, and it was hard not to notice the remarkable parallels between every part of that society and ours, between their politics and ours, and between the media censorship currently underway in Brazil and what we have here. Pretty remarkable and very informative if you're an American. Glenn Greenwald is an American. He's been in Brazil 17 years. He joins us to unpack this a little. Be right back. So we're in Brazil last week, part of the time in Rio, so naturally we hooked up with Glenn Greenwald, who lives there, went over to his house, had a bunch of interesting conversations. One of them's on tape. Here's part of it. So in American media, you often hear Bolsonaro dismissed as a dictator. Now, whatever you think of his policies, if he were a dictator, he would have the two things that all dictators have: A, a cult of personality, and B, a compliant media to reinforce that cult of personality. And as it turns out, Bolsonaro doesn't have either one of those things. In fact, Brazil does not have a significant media that challenges the establishment narrative. And we asked Bolsonaro why that is, and what would happen if something like, I don't know, Fox News existed in Brazil. Here's what he said. Why is there no Fox News in Brazil? CNN is here. You got over 50 million votes in the last election. CNN's a political player here, so is Globo, but there's no TV channel for your voters?
Well, if I could, launch an appeal to you, I can only say that you will be the most welcome in Brazil. You will be an excellent counterpart to the other vehicles or outlets. There are very few media outlets that are really unbiased in Brazil. That's something we need. And we do have one program in the Jovem Pan network called The Dots in the Eyes. The Dots in the Eyes, or The Dots on the Eyes, and they're excellent. They really showcase the good things going on in this country.
Flattering, we'll admit that not speaking Portuguese could be a hurdle in the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. But to the question of free speech, which really is the acid test, do you have free speech or don't you? Well, it's a really simple test. You have free speech when you can say something that most people consider offensive or outrageous, a view that is held by very few people, and not be punished for saying it. That's what free speech is. Does Brazil have free speech? Well, earlier this year, perhaps the most popular podcaster in the country, a guy known as Monarch, played out a thought experiment on his show in which he said, even extremist parties should be recognized by law in Brazil. Not that I'm for them, but you should be allowed to have any political party you want, because that's what freedom is. In response to saying this, the Attorney General of Brazil opened an investigation into Monarch. He was fired and kicked off of YouTube. Glenn Greenwald saw this happen in real time. He knows Brazil well. He's lived here for 17 years. He's an independent journalist with an emphasis on independent, and he joins us tonight with his assessment. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. So I was really struck. There's so much about Brazil that's amazing and impressive, and I understand why you moved here. But the question of free speech, media freedom, How does that stand, would you say, now in Brazil?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of living in a foreign country for a while is that you see some of the flaws of your country, but you also see a lot of the really good sides. And one of the things that exists in the United States that doesn't exist in a lot of other countries, including Brazil, is a more pluralistic media than is available in a lot of other places.
Yeah.
Even if it's just Fox News and other right-wing outlets, some places, as you just said, have none. Here in Brazil, the country has been notoriously dominated by 4 or 5 industrialized families who control almost all media, and their overarching ideology really is neither right nor left, but preservation of establishment power and ruling class orthodoxy. And they've had a lock on mainstream discourse for so long. The question of free speech as well, when Monarch, that podcast host that you just referenced, said, I think the government shouldn't have the power to ban certain political parties. To me, that is completely uncontroversial. That's the state of the law in the United States because of our Constitution. And when I defended him, one of the very few people who did, I was treated like a leper. People saying, this freedom of speech is a fascist ideology and we don't want it here. Which is so ironic, given that the hallmark of actual fascists is censorship, not free inquiry and free discourse. Right. And it's even more ironic, given that a lot of people on the left who don't believe in free speech here seem to trust either the government, currently run by President Bolsonaro, or American billionaires who control big tech, who they seem to be comfortable controlling their political discourse.
Well, it's interesting, and I should say, just because I don't think our audience knows, you did more than complain about the censorship of this podcast. You helped him get a new job, so bless you for that. But the question of American media is important here, because Bolsonaro, no matter what you think of him, relies pretty much exclusively on American-owned tech platforms, Twitter specifically, to get his message out. Doesn't that make him totally vulnerable to censorship by American companies?
Well, he has been repeatedly censored by big tech platforms. He, when speaking about COVID, was often censored. When speaking about the upcoming election, is often censored. So Facebook and Google are essentially dictating to Brazilians what they can and can't hear, including from their own democratically elected president. And again, no matter what you think of Bolsonaro, you should have to think that that's a pretty serious problem. And I think it's a very similar dynamic to what has happened in the U.S., where the entire establishment essentially united against Trump. And so all these institutions that liberals and the left in the United States have long held with such contempt, neocons and the security state and corporate media, all united against Trump, and suddenly they were viewed with such favor by the American left and by American liberalism. That has happened to a large extent here. Brazilian leftists will now often talk about Globo, long worst enemy of the Brazilian left, with a lot of gratitude and admiration. Yeah, it's the major media company that has become completely hostile to Bolsonaro because, again, Bolsonaro ran on a platform of anti-establishment challenge and defiance, and that's not what his government is, but just the rhetoric itself has made the establishment turn against him.
Amazing, amazing. The parallels here in Brazil, I would just recommend to everyone come and spend a week here. It's a remarkable reflection of our own society. Glenn Greenwald, thank you.
Great to be with you.
Great to see you. So Joe Biden and the puppet masters all around him are always telling us we need more women of color in positions of power. Well, what if a woman of color emerged in the Democratic Party with amazing talents and they were embarrassed of her and tried to suppress her voice? What would that tell you about how they really feel? We'll show you after the break. You have to wonder why it's left to this show, of all places, to announce the rising star, the next rising star in the Democratic Party. But it is, so we're going to. It's a woman called Tiara Mack. You never heard of Tiara Mack? Well, maybe that's because she's a state senator in the country's smallest state, Rhode Island. And you have to wonder why. This is a woman with demonstrated talent who has, as she announced on social media just this week, an Ivy League degree from Brown, but still technically Ivy League. Famous people send their kids there. Whatever, it's Brown. You should be impressed. And she's an amazing performer. Here's her latest campaign ad.
Vote Senator Mack.
So you ever have those moments where you see something and you're like, oh, that's the future. That's what it looks like. We saw Tiara Mack, head in the sand, twerking, and we thought, man, that's the Democratic Party 2020. So not everyone liked it, and she responded this way on Twitter, quote, damn, twerking upside down really makes the conservative unhinged internet accounts pop off on Monday. And nevertheless, she wrote, I'm really excited for the House sex ed bill hearing later today. Teaching comprehensive, queer, inclusive, pleasure-based sex ed was a highlight of my time teaching. And you gotta wonder, since she just summarized everything the Democratic Party is for, why isn't her own party embracing her? Why is she still a state senator in Rhode Island? Why isn't she Secretary of State? Why aren't they pushing her for president? Oh, she's not old enough. Really? Because the racist Constitution says she's not old enough? Why not change the Constitution? Why not make Tiara Mack your standard bearer in 2024? But they're not. They're pushing Joe Biden, who's like 100 years old, pale, stale Joe Biden, and then Hillary Clinton and Pete Buttigieg. Again, talk about systemic racism. Tiara Mack, 2024. She ought to run with the guy in the dress who oversees Biden's nuclear waste program. That's Sam Brinton. He's our new Deputy Assistant Secretary for Spent Fuel and Waste Disposition. Deals with the spent fuel rods. He's also got something called a puppy fetish. How do we know this? Well, it's all over social media. So, of course, he's in the Biden administration. So he ought to be right up there with Tiara Mack. And then she goes a step further. Why not make Rachel Levine head of DOD? He's already an admiral. Come on now. Be honest about who you are. People appreciate it. Tiara Mack, 2024. You might have noticed a lot of parents are homeschooling their kids recently. Why is that? Well, because of stories like this one. Jen Mason is a school board director in the state of Washington. She recently held an open mic night for kids under 18, including toddlers who identify as, quote, queer. Now she's hosting a series of sex ed workshops for kids as young as 9, because they need to hear her views on sex, not their parents, hers. Jason Rantz often acts as our Seattle-based West Coast correspondent. He broke this story on his radio show and his podcast. He joins us tonight for a recap. Jason Rantz, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, this story is so much creepier than I think people realize. So Jen Mason is inviting parents to bring kids as young as 9 years old to a private workshop next month. It's titled Uncringe Academy, and it's billed as an inclusive sex ed class, which she says offers, quote, empowerment and information rather than shame, fear, and judgment. Okay, but it also offers what I think most people might consider wildly inappropriate content for kids. Amongst the topics taught to these 9-year-olds will be gender and sexual identities, sexual anatomy for pleasure, what is sex, kinds of solo and partnered sexual activities, plus safer sex practices for all kinds of sexual activities. Now, when I asked the school board director about the material, she kind of downplayed a lot of it. She claimed that discussions about sex acts would not actually be the main focus of this course. But how does she define sex to these kids? It turns out rather nebulously. She told me in part, sex can really be any activity that a person does with themselves or others to become aroused. There's no such thing as real sex, and it's okay if your definition of sex is different from someone else's, a woman after Bill Clinton's heart. If you haven't been creeped out up until this point, how about this? The workshop's being held at Wink Wink Boutique, which is an all-ages sex shop in downtown Bellingham. You see, when Mason isn't actually serving on the school board, she runs Wink Wink as the owner, where she's also a sex coach. So these kids will walk past edible lubricant and suede floggers and sex toys named the Womanizer on the way to learn about inappropriate sex topics.
I don't understand. You talk to my 9-year-old in graphic ways about sex in a public park, I punch you in the face and call the cops. You do it in a school and I have to pay your salary and shut up? How does this work?
Yeah, I mean, they're very clearly leaning towards the more sort of woke curriculum. And of course, if you say anything, you're in the wrong, they're in the right, they know better.
Right. Yeah, I hope parents won't put up with it. Jason Rantz, thank you for your report, as always.
Thanks, Tucker.
So, obviously, the U.S. economy is heading toward a recession, if we have not yet already arrived. But CNN is on it. They're launching a new racial attack. If we get a recession, it'll be because of the skin color of the economists who predicted it. This is CNN. Actually, it's not, but CNN is next. So obviously a recession's coming. Most economists and CFOs are predicting one. The only question is how soon it gets here and how bad it is. Now, one of the groups that determines when a recession has officially arrived, in case you ever wondered, is called the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. You may have some questions about this. What metrics does NBER use to determine a recession? What will a recession mean for me? Et cetera, real questions. But over at CNN, the financial reporters can't be bothered with financial news or economics. Those are trivial to them. So instead at CNN, they just published a piece explaining why you should not care about the fact a recession is on the way because Joe Biden's president. Turns out calling something a recession is racist. Here's the headline, which belongs in a museum, and we hope we can put it there someday. It's this, quote, "Who decides if the U.S. is in a recession? 8 white economists you've never heard of." Did you hear that, lady? 8 white economists! They're calling it a recession! How dare they? Now, why is the skin color of an economist relevant to a prediction about a recession? See, I never explained that. But by including their skin color in the headline, not only did they move America a little bit closer to Rwanda, which of course is the point, they also distracted you from the fact that the current president is destroying the U.S. economy, making you poorer. And now that you know it's racist, you can just ignore it, like everything else that humiliates Joe Biden or reveals the incompetence of our rulers. So Ukraine is now demanding a lot more money from the United States. In fact, more money than its entire pre-war budget consisted of. Obviously, members of both parties in Congress will grant that request because securing Ukraine's border is their top priority, says Mitch McConnell. George W. Bush agrees. Nothing's more important than Ukraine. Certainly not our southern border, which remains completely open. Congressman Andy Biggs, who represents the state of Arizona, was at the border in Yuma a few days ago. Here's some of what he saw.
After they've crossed the reservation and walked on up this dirt road, and they come up here, CBP tells them they're going to sit down. They're going to wait now hours for buses to come and process these individuals and take them to the Yuma processing center. And what we would say military-age young men, single men, over there in that area. So there's lots going on here in the Yuma border.
So why is this happening? Super simple. Joe Biden opened the border and hasn't closed it. Why is he doing that? Probably a lot of reasons, all of them sinister, anti-democratic, and in fact evil. This is a crime. The United Nations just declared that the U.S.-Mexico border is the deadliest in the world. In the United States. Welcome to third world America. Multiple Texas counties declared today that what's happening at the border constitutes an invasion, because it does. Andy Biggs, as we told you, represents Arizona in the United States Congress. He joins us. And Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. So, members of Congress from Texas call this an invasion. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, it's fair. It's accurate. Arizona's Attorney General has said the same. And what you're seeing from the videos when I was down there, Tucker, that is a regular routine. And we met people from Georgia, all kinds of Latin American countries, African nations, China, India. That happens every morning. I mean, that was about 4 to 4:30 in the morning that day. And it's non-stoppable because we've basically said, come in. And you ask them, why are you here? And they'll say, Biden told us to come in. That is an invasion. That is an invasion.
So this will completely change America. In a democracy, the citizens get to decide what kind of country they want to live in. Now, the Biden administration it'll never be the same country, ever. Millions of new people, all illegal. So, why is this not a crime that's being prosecuted? Why isn't the president being impeached, for this?
Well, I think he should be. I think because they've deliberately, when I say they, I mean President Biden, Kamala Harris, Secretary Mayorkas, they have deliberately stopped enforcement under Title VIII, which is the Immigration and Nationalization Act. And then you also have Title 42 that they're hedging on. They're not enforcing the law. They're not allowing ICE to actually remove people. And they're actually surreptitiously providing a de facto amnesty program to a lot of people that they're catching and releasing. To me, that's a violation of the law. And it's dangerous to this country because, I mean, we could talk about terrorists, crime. We could talk about the drugs that are coming in. We could talk about the danger to the people that are coming in illegally.
But the guy in Viking horns is a threat to democracy. Biden and Mayorkas are a threat to democracy. A real threat, I would say. Congressman Andy Biggs, I appreciate it, from Arizona. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Tucker.
We introduced you to Tara Mack a minute ago. We need more. We know you do too. We will have more when we come back. Now, this is a TV show. We're not talent scouts, but when we see the future, we want to let you know about it. We want to raise up the next generation, in this case of Democratic leaders, and that means Tara Mack of Rhode Island, who right now, you can see her on the screen, she's a state senator, but we see a brighter future for her as a leader in that party. If they mean what they say about diversity, they'll elevate Tiara Mack to the position she deserves. Let's start as Secretary of State. But in fact, let's start on this show. She is invited on this show anytime, not just for a performance, but for an actual conversation about her performance and more. Tiara Mack, hope you're watching. Well, with that in mind, with our prayers heavenward for Tiara Mack to appear on our show, we turn now to Judge Janine, sitting in for Sean tonight. Hey, Judge.
I'm speechless.
So are we.
I mean, I'm speechless, which is a place I very rarely visit. But anyway, Tucker, it's good to see you.
Have fun there, Judge.
All right. Welcome to this special edition of Hannity. I'm Judge Janine Pirro in for